Yosemite Valley was William Hunter's inspiration for over 25 years. But a yearning for the sea was always a constant battle for this artist. His love for the ocean and its ever-changing beauty finally drew him back to his roots to Southern California. No longer restricted by the solitude of his previous surroundings, Hunter's work seems to come alive in his new environment. A new dialogue has begun. With this move has come a quest to explore, to expand his expressive voice with works that expound this newfound freedom.
Oh, look at the sparkling nectars and the crafts.
Isn't that something? I remember driving into your driveway up in Yosemite, and Bernard and I sort of sitting out front for a little bit. It's still dark, but waking up in the morning to the birds singing and the creek, the Merced River running by, and the wildflowers. A little different here.
It is a little different, but I'm still able to immerse myself in nature. Yeah. And there's a large similarity to the river moving by and the ocean currents and the tide pools.
Well,
and
this is kind of your home to begin with,
I did grow up here. I spent time here as a youngster fishing with my dad and working on the sport fishing boats. I'm very familiar with this coastline, and so the inspiration comes from a lot of different wells, and I'm able to use the ocean inspiration in a similar way that I use the walks in Yosemite. And I just need to say that I loved my time there. I was inspired there. The Miwok Indians wintered there. There was rich history, and I grew as an artist because I was able to focus on my work.
Right.
But I also needed more as I aged a little bit, and closer proximity to the museums and theater and musical events, and also being able to have some new friends. So it's been positive in a lot of ways, not only with the work growing, but I think growing as a person too. Have needed an excuse for growth. You get into patterns with your friends, and in Yosemite I was the guy that was on the slow pitch team, and we talked about firewood and trail walks and that, but I didn't have any art buddies. I didn't have a lot of spiritual elevation, and your friends are supposed to be people that bring you up and inspire you and help you grow, and we kind of stalled out in Yosemite. So this proximity to artists, and we have 6 or 8 very good artists in the community, and having a chat with them over coffee. I could just be driving into the community and stop and talk with Dan Pinkham for a little while. You leave that inspired, it's uplifting. And so, and also I've spent more focused time studying sculpture and learning the language of sculpture. And so I'm a lot more comfortable talking about things that used to be a little bit of a struggle with me. I knew them and I felt them intuitively, but I wasn't able to express how I got there or why I got there. That's coming a little easier now.
Speaking of art buddies, walking out here, I saw some formations that kind of reminded me of Marianne's work, and I know you guys have been sort of art buddies for a while.
Boy, we sure have. Yeah, we mentioned the Druzy rock as we were walking by there, and she uses that in her work. She's got a tremendous gift for having the enamel and the stones and the gold tell a nice story together. And early on, when we started collaborating, it was just a natural evolution from being in each other's studio, and I would see new ways of working and materials and vice versa. So we collaborated pretty heavily in the 80s and into the early 90s, and we got to a point where it had evolved quite a bit, and then it seemed like a natural spot to kind of take a break for several reasons. It's very hard to communicate now that the collaborations got so complex. It was more and more difficult to get to the center of the mission statement, if you will. And also the scale of my work started to increase quite a bit.
Right.
And I wanted to work more than intimate human scale and make a larger statement. I have a feeling we'll revisit it. In fact, we've been drawing and talking about some wall pieces.
A lot of your work actually reflects your feelings about the water, whether it be the river running by your house in Yosemite or your time on the Pacific Ocean.
Yes, boy, you say that and my mind just explodes because there are so many. One very good example of that would be the Garden series. And it's a tall series where the reeds come up and kind of twist in the wind. And that started out as a river-based series where I would see the grasses on the edge of the riverbank kind of twisting in the currents and undulating like that. And so the first couple were inspired by the river currents. And then Marianne and I were snorkeling off of Catalina Island, and I saw the kelps backlit, and that inspired the next series of the garden piece. So they were both water inspired, but they had a completely different feel. The way the light played through them, the amount of space and all that varied slightly.
A lot of the artists in this contemporary wood movement started as vessel makers. In fact, you started as a vessel maker. When did you experience the transition from vessel to sculpture, or do you feel that they're really one and the same, only just different form?
Both. I think that a vessel can very legitimately be a piece of sculpture. I think that there are elements of vessel that speak in the realm of sculpture, but probably in the early 80s I started exploring different ways of cutting them open and letting light in and working with interplay, dialogue of the interior and exterior surface. And it stepped along for a few years, mostly on a small scale. And then the most significant event was about the late 80s. I did a piece called I Can Hear the Sea. And it really was cut open, and you were let in, and space and negative space became a much larger part of the piece for me. And I also changed the way it sat from a vessel pose, and it had a different energy presented on its side. And I think that was really a major turning point in sculptural presentation and feeling about the work. I was always interested in speaking through the work, but coming to it from a self-taught person and reading a lot and studying, you could feel it happening in little increments. And I felt that that was kind of a benchmark piece for me in changing realms. And I think that was a switch from decorative arts to more of a fine arts. Although I don't really feel a need to distinguish there. I think that if you're working from your heart, informed, and you're trying to make a piece with a distinct personality and make it contemplative, that's my goal. Whether somebody is going to call it a decorative art or in the fine arts, I don't really struggle with that. As long as it's personal expression, that's the most important thing to me.
I really enjoyed the Tangled Helix series that you worked on. That's really a departure from a lot of the things that you've done.
Well, I really enjoyed that series. It happened at a time in my life when we had moved from Yosemite down to the ocean. And after 30 years in Yosemite, it just started feeling a little closed in, and I needed a change. And friends had moved away and changed, and the river canyon just seemed a little tight. And after a lot of negotiating with Marianne, we finally moved down here. And it just was a spiritual lift, and you can see what a nice view, and oftentimes your emotions are reflected in your work. And all of a sudden, these elements that I'd been carving into and through the vessels, I released them completely from the vessel and then started reconfiguring the elements. And it just took my imagination. It spoke to feelings of infinity and defying gravity and transformation, and I really felt that after all these years exploring with the vessels that I had in fact reached kind of a new level with them. That finally they were affecting space a little differently. I get the feeling that I'm actually kind of bending space with some of them. They have a way of kind of revealing personal relationships. One can rest with the other, be embraced by it. They can be separate, the way they dialogue, and it just brought in a whole new field of references. And so the walls of the vessel have kind of disappeared, and all the feelings of containment and inside and outside are now gone, and you just affect space differently. And instead of having a complete form in space, now you're kind of grounded and soaring with the form. And I wasn't really trying to make a point of what it feels like when I'm out at sea and the birds are flying around a rock or above the bait or whatever, but that metaphor came to mind during the process of working, and then I knew where I wanted to go with it, and it became those circling birds, and it just helped the concept gel for me. I allowed myself to get a sport fishing boat, and that has added great adventure to my life, and it allows me to get out with friends. And one of the ways that all these things affect the work, and one of the pieces that came out of that, when you and I go over to the east end, there's that spot where the channel currents meet the ocean currents, and we're in that confused sea, and there's all those strange rhythms and everything. And that concept revealed itself in a piece called Glimmer and Cross Currents.
Right, I know.
And all that opposing energy and the lights kind of reminded me of the Whitecaps. Well, I didn't start out thinking about those ocean currents when I was sculpting the piece, but as soon as those opposing forces started going together, it clicked. That's where I am. And then that helps the soul of the piece get worked out.
Oh, do you think that that's maybe the subconscious revealing itself through your work, and then all of a sudden it dawns on you what's going on?
Absolutely, absolutely. I work in that intuitive subconscious.
Because you don't usually sketch out what you're going to do.
I usually sketch on the material. Right. It's a spontaneous relationship with the material. Yeah. If you get too programmed and you have a preconceived notion about where you're going to take this piece of wood, I don't really think you're going to end up with a soulful piece of work when you're done.
But your work is so refined and so exact sometimes, or it appears to be. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the rhythm that it holds. Is that just from having such a wonderful partnership and understanding of that material?
No, there's a lot of reasons there. I started out as a pipe maker, and that perfection, and I came to this art as a craftsman first, and sometimes in spite of myself, I need to refine surface and have attention to detail.
You mean things need to stand up straight?
And sometimes I fight that, but for the most part, I feel that it adds integrity to the work, and that's fine with me. Something that I did want to mention with you that is an area that's fascinated me, and we haven't had a chance to talk about yet, is the vibrational energy that comes off these pieces, and that subconscious level of how this is affecting the viewer. And I have been fascinated with Kandinsky's theory of how colors and their composition in relation to each other affect this energy on not in an area of language, but in the subconscious, and also with musical chord arrangements, or the John Cage theory of a horn honking and silence and sound composition, if you will, and how those relate to the energy that comes off the sculpted object. So my feeling is that with the fluted vessels and repeated rhythms, or space by absence, that they are from the same well. And it's not an area that I can really talk about, but I am aware of where it affects you, you know. And, you know, Matisse had a quote that I'm fond of, where he talks about art of harmony and beauty and elegance and lifting the human spirit. And I feel that that's my gift in that realm, that's the purpose of my work, is to make people feel good and to strike that chord. And I'm good at it because that's what I'm trying to convey a lot.
It's interesting how people can influence us sometimes. I know that Irv Lipton played a really important part in your growth.
He sure did. He sure did. There's collectors, and then there's patrons. And he was so good and he met Marianne at a show in Westwood and bought a couple little pieces. I think it was 79 or something like that. And then he called me up Monday morning after the show and said, I spoke with your wife and I bought a couple of your pieces. And she was telling me about some of the pieces that were in progress. And, you know, when they're done, why don't you bring them down to the office? I'd like to take a look at them. And he was a pediatrician, and his artists kind of became his kids along the way, and he took me under his wing, and it was just fabulous. I would share ideas with him, and he would light up and say, go make them. Just, you know, I'd say, Irv, I want to work on this concept in a series, and maybe I could develop 3 pieces that work together. And he would just say, let your imagination fly, you've got carte blanche. And it was an artist's dream to just get cut loose like that and have somebody appreciate your work. And we had a tremendous, very involved relationship with him for 5 to 7 years. He probably ended up with close to 135 pieces of my work and some collaborations with Marianne. And it had a profound effect on letting me soar, because sometimes you need the positive feedback to keep going. Some of these series are pretty esoteric and they don't have a wide range of appeal, and you could put your heart and soul into them, but they might not get received at a show, and so you wouldn't be inspired to keep pursuing that series. But when you had a chance to talk to the person that was going to end up with the piece, it really completed the creative cycle when it would leave the studio and it would find its way into his home, and he would have new insights and appreciation for the work. It really added to the creative energy very much. He was great. Irv allowed me to explore a vision in a group and get some depth and refine thought in a series, and then my imagination would go on to the next one, and I would have a 5 or 7 piece series. And a lot of artists stop there. They feel like they've made their statement and it's done. And I always feel like there's more room for growth there, and I can go back after it and explore a little bit. And sometimes I kind of wish that I was able to also thrive in the political realm. Like right now, I wish I had a gift of talking about an unjustified war and environmental recklessness and social injustice, and but that's not my gift. I can talk about it and have other ways of expressing it, but my gift is relaying life and alluding to motion and those kinds of life-affirming energies.
There is a history involved in each piece that William Hunter creates, from the growth and stress of the tree to the mood and growth of the maker, and their place in the scheme of things. Hunter's designs, from a vessel adorned only by the brushstroke of nature to the most complex carved and constructed pieces, each have their own rich but single voice that embody this history, reflecting a sensuality of colors, patterns, and textures that speak of timeless universal rhythms, which repeat themselves in all of nature. I hope you've enjoyed our time with sculptor William Hunter in this edition of Beyond Wood, Portrait of an Artist.